Welcome to the UnionDues podcast. The UK's only all things union show, produced for your downloadable digital delight and appreciation. In this week's episode, Philippa Childs, Head of Entertainment and Media Union Bectu, on what needs to be done to protect our creative industries, Mel Simms' Thought for the Week, and Josiah Mortimer's Radical Roundup. Hello everyone, hello, you're very welcome to UnionDues, the UK's only all things union podcast. I'm Simon Zappa and we've got a fabulous episode lined up for you this week. Our special guest will be Philippa Childs, who is head of Bectu, the Broadcasting, Entertainment, Communications and Theatre Union, part of Prospect, but very much autonomous in terms of its policy and its campaigning work. She gives us a great insight into what Bectu is doing on behalf of its members and with its members to defend them in the current terrible, uncertain and negative times for that sector. We've also got a cracking thought for the week from Professor Mel Simms, talking about why it's so important to have a seat at the bargaining table. And, well, here's a riddle for you, listeners. What do you call an employer that wants to be accredited as a living wage employer that doesn't actually pay the living wage? Well, you'll have to listen to Josiah Mortimer's Radical Roundup to get the answer on that one. Well, we've got so much good stuff on this week's show, I really don't know quite where to start, but I think the best place to begin is with Mel's Thought for the Week. Now, Mel, as you know, is Professor of Work and Employment at the University of Glasgow, and this week she looks at what the post-COVID industrial relations landscape could look like.
This week, I've been thinking about work and employment as we move into a world beyond the COVID crisis and what role trade unions have in that. At workplace level, I think the answer is pretty clear. Our unions have long fought to ensure our workplaces are as safe as they can be, and they've done a superb job in continuing that work during the COVID crisis, and I'm sure that will continue for a long time to come. But more widely, it's important that there are spaces for unions in wider discussions about the economy once the crisis has subsided. The public during this time has radically reassessed what services they deem to be essential, as well as reassessing the role of the state in general during an international crisis. So what matters now is whether those reassessments can be embedded in a shift of thinking about how work and employment are regulated. And it seems to me that there are likely to be multiple spaces over the coming months and years where the importance of collective regulation can be argued, even to a government that's not ideologically inclined to accept that position. Slightly counterintuitively, working with employers is a particular priority. And I say that because I'm a researcher with a particular interest in the international histories of industrial relations systems in many countries around the world. And if we look back to times where there have been major shifts in ideas about how work and employment are regulated, both in the UK and elsewhere, we see that building alliances with employers is really important to shaping those institutions that collectively regulate work. In the UK, we've seen that those tripartite negotiations between the government, the TUC and the CBI around the furlough scheme were a really important moment in addressing the COVID crisis. And we also know that the TUC and CBI have been working together over important issues around Brexit as well. While they don't always agree, and they certainly don't always represent the same positions, that's what negotiation is for. But before we can have a systematic input from employers and unions into government policy making, they need to be at the table. And that argument for a seat at the table needs to be made consistently, loudly, clearly, if we hope to embed some of those lessons around public health, but also around work and employment over the coming months and years.
Thanks very much, Mel. Now, my takeaway from that is you shouldn't think too much about what you want from negotiations before you're sure you've got a seat at the negotiating table. And you need to strategize. You need a strategy to make sure that we can get that seat at the table and that we can keep it and that we can use it. And there are many ways to achieve that end. I think that's the key message I take from it. And to talk about those methods and those ways could take up a series of podcasts in itself. But I take it that listeners, that you take the point. And that sets the scene nicely, I think, for our special guest for this episode, Philippa Childs. Philippa is head of Bectu. Now, when Bectu merged with Prospect in 2017, I think a lot of people, me included, I have to say, wondered exactly how it was going to work out. But as Philippa tells us, it's a process that's left both sections of the merged union stronger than they were before. So, Philippa, thank you very much for joining us on the UnionDues podcast. I mean, it's an insanely busy period for those working in the arts and the creative media. And of course, in your section, Bectu, you also have communication workers. And of course, we know that elsewhere in the communication sector, there's industrial strife with CWU members taking industrial action, for example, as we speak to record. So thank you so much for making time for this.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to talking about and reflecting, I suppose, on, what has been a very difficult year. I suppose one theme that has been throughout the year, right from when the pandemic broke and the lockdown started, was there are many, many Bectu members, self-employed members, freelancers, as well as those who would expect to be employed, albeit on a series of very short-term contracts, who are just left out of the government protection for workers who can't work because of the pandemic. And now, I suppose there's an extra hit in the sense that Brexit is making it very difficult for people to move around Europe as a whole. Have you been able to get any movement in the government's position by showing just how problematic this is? And what are your hopes for the forthcoming budget in this regard? So I guess it's been a very frustrating time, certainly for those who have been excluded from government support schemes, many of which are, do work in the creative industries. And I think it's been really frustrating for us that, from a very early stage, way back in April last year, we were telling the government about the various groups that have been excluded for different reasons and actually giving them good solutions to be able to resolve those exclusions. And yet, almost a year later, the government hasn't done anything to fill the gaps. And some of them would be incredibly easy to resolve. So it's certainly very frustrating from our point of view. And I think we feel desperately sorry, I suppose, that certainly very regretful that we haven't really been able to achieve any significant movement in the government's position. And what we've had to do instead is to rely on, certainly the devolved nations have put in place support for some groups. And thankfully, some of the sector's charities have stepped up and provided some funds to support freelancers through this period. And it's impacted different people in different ways. So thankfully, film and TV are back at work. They've been able to work through the latest lockdown thanks to the really good protocols that have been put in place. But for our members who are freelancers, either in theatre or live event, they have literally had no work and no income from the creative industries and no support from government for, as I say, almost a year, and have had to look for work elsewhere during that period. And as you say, along comes Brexit and the whole visa debacle, which will impact them for certainly the months to come as well.
The agony continues, I suppose, for people in that space in the creative sector, because even under the arrangements the Prime Minister announced this week, the roadmap, it's going to be theatres, it's going to be live music, it's going to be that area, which has to wait to the last of all before it can come back. Now, you can understand the reasons for that, but it surely therefore begets government to say, we recognise there's a problem here, we need to do something, because otherwise there's going to be this drain of talent and culture and capacity from the sector, which can't just be turned on like a tap.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately some people will have decided that they, just can't live with the precarious nature of working as a freelancer in the creative industries and will have decided to make a career change. But for the rest, yes, the agony goes on. And actually, we've this week written to the Chancellor again about the groups that are excluded, but also to say there are things that you need to do to support theatre and live events through the next few months, and so that they can come back. So things like putting in place a scheme to underwrite insurance for theatres, similar to the one that is there for film and TV, which will help if there's an outbreak and theatres have to close down again just as they start to open. And we've also asked the government to consider something which has, again, been a theme for several months now, which is Seat Out to Help Out, which is, a subsidised for every theatre seat that someone buys. We're urging the government to subsidise another seat so that theatres can come back in a way that is viable for them.
Gosh, Seat Out to Help Out. Now that puts me in mind of an initiative the government used last summer. What was it? Oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. Yeah. Well, I mean, as you say, these are things that have been tried and tested, and let's just hope the Chancellor's listening. Moving on, I mean, your inbox must be full to overflowing because as well as all this, there is this ongoing kind of rumbling vendetta against public, and that's my choice of word, against public service broadcasting. And it's not just, as we went into the pandemic, it was looking like there were storm clouds once again gathering over the BBC, but now we have this kind of almost unseemly rush to license partisan TV broadcasting, sort of Fox News for the UK, which just makes, a terrifying prospect of public service broadcasting being contaminated in this way. What's the current lie of the land from a Bectu perspective? What are the immediate objectives that you're trying to secure?
Yeah, you're right. I remember very clearly a conversation with my comms team just prior to the pandemic really hitting us and lockdown being put in place, where we were talking about a planned campaign to highlight, I suppose, the huge benefits and why the BBC was so important to our democracy. And my colleague turned to me and said, "Oh, it's all going to be coronavirus from now on in, isn't it?" And we were like, that campaign will certainly have to go on the back burner for the time being. And I think, or even skeptics would say that the BBC really has stepped up through the pandemic and provided all sorts of useful resources for parents and, lots of good drama. And, where would we be without television through this period? And I think the BBC has played a huge, important role in that. But inevitably, it faces challenges into the future. And I think that the new Director General, Tim Davie, recognises the challenges that he faces. And that is really making sure that the BBC is relevant for the future and represents the whole of the UK and is seen to be bringing news which is unbiased. And we all of us have things that irritate us from time to time about the BBC. But I think overall, there are things that it might want to do differently. But overall, I think we really should value public service broadcasting more generally, but the BBC in particular, because it is world beating and the envy of the world. So I think we will return to the campaign around public service broadcasting, why it's so important, and particularly, as you say, why it's so important as other broadcasters come into the public arena. I mean, you only have to look at the US, don't you, to see what happens if all you've got is very partisan broadcasters in play. I don't think things are quite as difficult for the BBC as perhaps they were pre-pandemic. Obviously, the government decided against decriminalisation of the non-payment of the licence fee. And so I think it's probably in a better place. But nevertheless, I think it's always important to highlight what is important in terms of the BBC and the public service broadcasting more generally, and remind people of all of the things that they get for their licence fee.
Accentuate the positive, as the old song the old song goes. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the word that comes into my mind about partisan TV, and you look at what, as you say, what's happening in the States, and fear that sort of stuff could be coming up our way, is there is a lack of dignity about it, and dignity is a strong theme in Bectu's work. He said switching horses almost seamlessly. And the story that caught my eye recently was concerns by Bectu members at Studio Lambert, who are the people who make Gogglebox, who were saying that they were in a toxic work culture. They were being abused when they go to work. That's not what they go to work for. And I know the union stepped in and
discussions are ongoing. But that's part of a bigger campaign by the union, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We launched, again, prior to the pandemic, we launched our Dignity at Work campaign. And I think it was really an attempt to set a standard across the industry for how people were treated at work, whether they were employees, whether they were freelancers, whether they worked in a broadcaster or on a film set or in a theatre or live events. And I think we sort of recognised that there were certain issues which were endemic across the industry, and we wanted to try and collaborate with others across the industry, the BFI, BAFTA, Film and TV Charity, broadcasters, engagers, to try and sort of reset things, I suppose, a little bit. And I think, as you say, you've talked about the Gogglebox story which hit the papers, but actually it's not a one-off by any stretch of the imagination. And it does seem that certainly in the last few months, people have been prepared to talk more about what they're experiencing at work, and bullying and harassment in particular seems to be a huge problem and something that the industry collectively needs to address, I think, for the sake of its reputation, but obviously more importantly, the people who work within it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is clearly much common ground between employers, unions, providers, consumers as well, I guess, about minimum standards. And I suppose it's a question of building a careful but wide-ranging coalition so you marginalise the bad behaviour. It's certainly an important area. I mean, I know in the podcasting sector there's a lot of concern about that as well. And it kind of goes hand in glove, I think, with issues about diversity and inclusivity, because there's an awful lot of intersectionality that I see as I talk to people between gender and race and disability and economic standing and so on. What's the Bectu position on that, and how can you mobilise around that? I mean, it's easy to identify, but it's harder to do something about, I think.
It really is, and you're right. Actually, I think if I'm going to be really positive and optimistic about one really important thing actually that has happened throughout the pandemic is that all of us in the industry have been very good actually at collaborating, working together. It's been really it's been really inspiring actually that broadcasters, indies, PACT, the Film and TV Charity, lots of organisations who operate across the industry have worked together to, first of all, highlight the challenges that the industry has faced, but also to pledge to do better in some of these really challenging issues. And I think for me, equality and diversity is achieving real equality and diversity across the creative industries is a massive challenge. And we've seen over many years lots of initiatives to try to make broadcasters more diverse, to commission more diverse projects, and to enable more diverse workforce, whether that be, as I say, employees or freelancers. And yet I would say the feeling across the industry is that those initiatives haven't really worked, and that they go around in cycles, but they don't really achieve an awful lot. I mean, I'm an optimist, and so what I would say is that, again, through this period, following the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and activity earlier last year, that broadcasters have stepped up. They have increased the amount of resource and the focus that they've put into achieving diversity. I think there is a recognition now that it's doubly important for them to focus on diversity, not only because, they should be more diverse organisations themselves, but also the importance of them then being able to tell diverse stories is absolutely crucial to their future success. And so I hope that through various initiatives, and certainly that's a priority for me, to try to make sure that we play a part in ensuring that the industry across, as I say, film, TV, broadcasting, theatre and live events, gaming, all look different in the future.
I mean, you talk about Bectu playing a part, but I mean, it's more than just a bit part here. I mean, this is a leading role. One of the strengths of the union is a kind of vertical structure. Bectu represents everyone from the runner to big top drawer directors. I mean, in the past, people like David Putnam, Alan Parker, they've all been Bectu or its predecessors members. Now, I suppose that's great in some way because it means you have the breadth of view, but equally, it absolutely reinforces what you say, because if the view is overwhelmingly white and male, then there are voices that are missing, and therefore the product is less appealing, less engaging, and limited in terms of its range of content.
That's absolutely true. And when I was appointed to this role, very early on, it became apparent to me what a huge challenge the industry faced in terms of improving its diversity, and as you say, from top to bottom, quite frankly. And so for me, if we can, and yes, you're right, we are playing an important part. Our activists are really engaged and ambitious to achieve change. And if we can make that change over the next few years, however challenging the environment may be, then that will be a huge achievement as far as I'm concerned.
Indeed. It certainly will be. And it leads me on to think about the value of the Bectu brand, if I can put it that way, because, of course, some years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, wasn't it? Bectu decided to tie up with Prospect. And as well as being head of Bectu, you are a deputy general secretary at Prospect. But there was a very conscious view I detected from everyone in that family that the Bectu brand had real value, real traction, and therefore it was something that should be invested in and nurtured rather than absorbed into something bigger. I mean, am I being too starry-eyed about that, or is that true, do you think?
No, it is true. I think it's absolutely true. I guess, like all mergers, we have had our moments as we try to bring two groups of staff and activists together, and two different cultures. So I'm not going to pretend it hasn't had its challenges.
Well, mergers are never easy.
Exactly. But actually, I would argue that it has been the perfect model, because retaining the Bectu brand is hugely important in the industry. Without a shadow of a doubt, Bectu has had a good profile for many years, and to lose that would have been definitely to lose something important. But to have the resources of Prospect and the support of the wider Prospect family has also been very important, and it's enabled us to do lots of the things that we've been able to do over the last, as you say, for nearly 5 years now.
Okay, so if we take a little look into the future, and as much as anyone can see clearly into the future, and we were say sitting down around Christmas time, looking back over the year, what do you hope for over the coming 6-7 months?
Well, obviously, I hope that all of our members will get the opportunity to go back to work. And I think they will. As I said, film and TV production is happening now, but my expectation is that will really gain momentum later on in the year, and there will be lots more production going on. And that obviously theatres, I think we're all feeling very sort of emotional at the thought of theatres opening again and being able to go and see shows in the West End and in fact across the UK, and for live events to start again. So I certainly hope by the end of the year we're looking at a position where all of our members have been able to get back to work, that there are more opportunities for people to be successful in the industry, that diversity is at the centre of all of that, and that obviously that Bectu continues to grow, both in terms of membership but also influence.
Well, my thanks to Philippa for a really wide-ranging, engaging discussion. The range of occupational interests that Bectu is campaigning on is really challenging, impressive. The work on dignity, particularly in employment, I think is very important, as we'll hear when we come to the Radical Roundup and some of the discussion that flows on from that. But if you want to know any more about any of the campaigns that we touched on during our discussion, any of the resources that are available to support Bectu members or support the issues that people in the creative sector more generally have, then go over to the makesyouthink.com website. On the blog page of that website, you'll find the companion post to this podcast, gives you all the links, all the signposting you could need. You'll find it, as I say, on makesyouthink.com. Now it's time for our regular roundup of industrial news, and no better place to start than with Josiah Mortimer's Radical Roundup.
Thanks, Simon. First up, concerns are growing over allegations that the owner of a luxury car firm has not paid his workforce to the tune of about 170 grand while they've been furloughed. Workers at Luna Automotive, which moved from Preston to Blackpool shortly after the uproar, are threatened with the possibility of redundancy, and if they keep their jobs, it will be on inferior fire and rehire terms. Unite the Union wants HM Revenue and Customs to probe the business affairs of the company's owner, Nicholas Marks, into allegations that he claimed money from the taxpayer-funded job retention scheme, but didn't pass it on to the 45-strong workforce. The workers haven't been paid since August last year. Next up, the government must extend opening hours for polling stations in May's local elections to keep staff and the public safe, Unison has said today. The union has written to Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government Robert Jenrick and the Local Government Association calling for action and assurances to ensure stations don't become hotspots for infection spread. In the letter, Unison, the largest union for council staff, points out that many buildings traditionally used for voting, such as schools, will not be suitable this May. The letter also calls for more government funding to address staffing shortages caused by the pandemic. Now a story ahead of the budget this Wednesday. The unemployment rate for black and ethnic minority workers has risen at more than twice the speed of the unemployment rate for white workers, according to new TUC analysis of official stats published on Saturday. The analysis of figures from the ONS reveals that the BME unemployment rate shot up from 5.8% to 9.5% between the last quarter of 2019 and the final quarter of 2020, an increase of nearly two-thirds. Over the same period, the unemployment rate for white workers rose by just 1 percentage point. The TUC says that the number of BME people out of work is already exceeding the worst-case scenario prediction. Staying with the budget, the National Union of Journalists is calling for the Chancellor to stand up for journalism, with a package of measures to revitalise the ailing sector. The NUJ is calling for a levy on tech giants to create a sustainable fund that can inject much-needed investment that's targeted at grassroots journalism and news. The NUJ joined with journalist unions across the US, Australia and Canada this week to condemn the bullying action of Facebook and to call on governments around the world to show real leadership in protecting the public's right to information. And finally, IKEA is refusing to pay workers the real living wage, but wants to keep its status as a living wage employer, the GMB union has said. The home furnishings giant is still proudly displaying a plaque in the reception of its sites, and is still listed on the Living Wage Foundation website, despite refusing to honour the 20 pence per hour increase announced by the Living Wage Foundation in November 2020. Employers have 6 months to implement the change, but IKEA has indicated it will not meet this deadline and has asked the Living Wage Foundation for its accreditation to be paused. But despite this, it's still boasting being a living wage employer. Thanks very much. That's all from this week's Radical Roundup in the UnionDues podcast, but you can find the full Radical Roundup on Wednesday at leftfootforward.org. Back to you, Simon.
Many thanks indeed for that, Josiah. And you will have noticed that in that section was the answer to the riddle from the top of the show. What do you call a living wage employer that doesn't actually want to pay the living wage? It seems you call them IKEA. Shame, shame, shame. Other things arising from that, and I think the most standout issue is the institutionalized racism that still exists in our society that's revealed by that TUC survey on how COVID has affected BME workers. And structural racism in the labour market is what the TUC calls it, and it's hard to disagree. And it incenses me, I have to tell you listeners, when you have people who are critical of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. There is sustained, deeply embedded racial injustice in our society. And unless we recognise it and call it out for what it is, how are we ever going to make progress to a just and fair society for everyone? So with that in mind, I'm happy to bring to your attention an event that's been organised and hosted by the GMB National Race Leads Group, and it's called Maximising Black Activism in Trade Unions. Now, this is a web-based event, obviously. Kicks off at 6 p.m. tomorrow. That's the 3rd of March. Speakers include Roger McKenzie, Robbie Scott, Charlene Nacum and Sarah Owen MP. And it looks like it's going to be a really useful, worthwhile, practically based discussion. If you go to gmb.org.uk/equality events, you can find all the details and register to take part. Well, we're nearly out of time for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed what you've heard. I hope it's made you think. I hope it's given you some fuel for the fire in terms of campaigning and organising. If you like what you've heard, if you don't like what you've heard, if you've got an idea for what you'd like to hear more of, if you've got a question for the show, you can contact us by email, UnionDues@makesyouthink.com. You can tweet us at DuesUnion. If you could rate us on the podcast platform of your choice, that would be great. Really helpful. Very much appreciated. You can head over to the makesyouthink.com website where you'll find the companion blog for this episode, all the links, all the signposting, all the background you will need in that piece. My usual shout out to my friends and colleagues in the Labour Radio Podcast Network, a portal through which you can access this and around 70 other trade union or labour related shows. A real cornucopia. So, my thanks to Philippa, my thanks to Josiah and Mel for their excellent pieces as usual. My thanks to you for choosing to spend some of your valuable time with us today. Whatever you're doing, please stay safe. Let's look after each other. Let's carry on being kind. And until the next episode of Union Dues, be seeing you around. Bye for now. The Union Dues podcast is presented by me, Simon Sapper. It is a Makes You Think production.